If you have ever looked up into the night sky, you will see thousands of stars. But at first glance, you might not realize what is truly out there. According to the current scientific understanding of the universe, there are trillions upon trillions of these dots we call stars. But if you have ever read the creation story as told in the Bible, then it might seem like God made all of these stars as an afterthought. Apparently, God is not allowed to do this, so let's talk about that. He made the stars also. God spends a day making light before making the stars and separating light from darkness. Then, at the end of a hard day's work and almost as an afterthought, he makes a trillions of stars. Genesis 1 verse 16. Now, if you have ever read Genesis 1 before, then you might already see that the author made a little mistake in his argumentation. But before we get to that, let's read the passage and see if you caught on to this mistake. And God said, "Let there be lights in the firmament of heaven to divide the day from the night, and let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and years. And let them be for lights in the firmament of heaven to give light upon the earth," and it was so. And God made the two great lights, and the greater light to rule the day, and the lesser light to rule the night. He made the stars also. And God set them in the firmament of heaven to give light upon the earth, and to rule over the day and over the night, and to divide the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good. And the evening and the morning were the fourth day. Based on this passage, I think it is pretty clear that it at least seems like God made all of these stars as an afterthought. So the author does have a point here. But as an afterthought, I thought I should add a little spice to this conversation and say that making stars isn't that difficult. It's just a mere copy-paste action. Of course, I'm just kidding and pulling your leg. Not literally, I hope. But before I bore you out of your mind with my stupid jokes that doesn't make any sense and aren't funny, let's get to the real stuff, shall we? First off, I want to argue about the inconsistency itself. How is this supposed to be inconsistent in the Bible? What is it supposed to be inconsistent with? You know, there has to be something that we know to be the truth to compare with this passage so that we can say that this passage is inconsistent with the truth. I might just be playing stupid, but I can see it in the argument of this inconsistency. If you are saying that this is inconsistent with the fact that God cannot make anything as an afterthought, then I think you are wrong. I mean, we have established that this is not the case in the very first video by pointing out that God is all-powerful. Nothing is impossible for him. So he could easily create trillions and trillions of stars after a hard day's work. If you're saying that it is inconsistent with the fact that God always has a plan and is always sticking to his plan, whereas it seems to be the opposite in this passage, then I also think you're wrong, and I will explain why. If the Bible only mentions something very briefly, that doesn't necessarily mean that it is inconsistent or that it was written in the Bible as an afterthought. In fact, I think in this passage it was done very deliberately. Verses 14 and 15 simply point out that God created the lights in order to give light to the earth. Verses 16 to 19 then just goes into more detail on what specifically he created. It just tells us that the bigger lights were the sun and the moon, and this was just said in a very poetic way. It then just also includes the stars afterwards in order to just point out that the stars were a part of the light which God created on this day. But why would God write it this way, I hear you ask? Well, I think it's just simply to draw attention to the sun and the moon. God describes the sun and the moon as light to point out that they were merely created to give light to the earth and that they shouldn't be worshipped as gods. Also, the sun and the moon are the objects in the sky which we give most of our attention to. So they are the most important lights in our life and should be emphasized in a similar manner. Whatever the case might be, I think it is stupid to accept this as an inconsistency just because it seems like the stars were made as an afterthought. Now, let's see if you saw the mistake I pointed out earlier in this video. In the way you worded this inconsistency, it seems like you think that God made light and the stars on the same day. But this is just factually wrong. As I explained in video 1, God created the concept of light on day 1 and then just created the sun, moon and stars on day 4 in order to replace this light so that he doesn't have to give the light to earth for all eternity. This means that the universe can now run on its own without God's interference. Yes, these lights were also created to give light to the earth. And yes, these lights were also created to divide light from darkness. But this was all mentioned in this passage just to emphasize that these lights were merely created to replace what God was already doing from day 1. Let me know in the comments if you saw this inconsistency in the argumentation from the beginning. Now, I'm gonna make my last point through a question. How do you know God made the stars at the end of the day? Could he not create the stars and then the sun and moon? Could he not spend 1 minute creating the sun and the moon and then the rest of the 24 hours to create the stars? From this question alone, your argument falls apart. Of course, I don't think that he did it this way. I simply think that God took any amount of time in the day to make these 3 things. As pointed out in the first video, God could have simply made all of his creation in a mere split second. But he didn't do it this way because he had certain doctrines in mind to teach us. Okay, that was quite a long discussion, but I think I've made my case for why this inconsistency doesn't make any sense. So let's review it. Now, since this inconsistency isn't really an argument for anything and merely just a sentence saying that I don't think God can do X, therefore it has to be inconsistent, it doesn't deserve any special treatment. I like to take these arguments and structure them in a logical argument form and then improve on this argument by changing the premises that are incorrect. So what I've decided to do is to give you my argument in logical argument form on this topic. So here we go. Premise 1, God created light on day 1. Premise 2, God created the sun, moon and stars on day 4. Premise 3, God seems to have created the stars as an afterthought. Premise 4, God is all-powerful. Premise 5, God always has a plan as read in various verses in the Bible shown on screen. Conclusion, the sun, moon and stars were merely created to replace what God did on day 1. Since he is all-powerful, he can make the stars in any length of time he fancies, therefore it could seem to be an afterthought in text when in fact it was part of the plan all along. So there you have it, my brothers and sisters. God created the trillions and trillions of stars we see in our universe, and for someone to think that it was merely made as an afterthought hasn't considered the real impact of a statement like that. If you're interested to see how the fact that God made trillions of stars could be inconsistent with the amount we see on Earth, then please watch the video on screen right now. Thank you all for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed and I will see you in the next one. Cheers!